Bree Aesie is an English teacher, a podcaster, and the owner of a popular English school in Spain. But she is also an expert in psychology, specifically how children learn languages, which is going to be the focus of our conversation today. So, if you are a non-native English speaker and you are wondering about the best way to introduce English to your child, well, keep watching as Bree is going to go into this subject in great detail. From how to read books and stories with your child, through to how children's linguistic capabilities develop. This interview is packed full of actionable tips and ideas for how to help your child enjoy learning English from a young age. So that's it. I hope you will enjoy this conversation with Bree Aesie. Okay, hello, Bree.
Hello, Alastair.
Hi, it's great to see you here. I'm joined by Bree Aesie, who is the host of an amazing podcast called Into the Story. And I'm super excited to speak with you today, as I understand you are kind of an expert on psychology and language acquisition in kids. And what I'd like to do is keep the focus of our conversation really around kind of how kids learn languages, what parents can do to help their kids learn English if they're non-native English speakers, and how talk a bit more about how languages can be learnt at home. So there's lots of really, really good stuff to get into. Before we do that, can you just give our viewers a very quick introduction to yourself, in case they don't know who you are?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited. This is the second time, actually, we've done a little collaboration. The first time was, I think, a couple of years ago. And at the time, I think I had a new baby, but you still had number one. And now we have even more in common, I understand.
We do, yeah. Exactly. Four boys, I believe, between us.
Yeah, 4 boys between us, goodness. My name is Bree, and I am the host of a podcast called Into the Story. I'm from Canada, and I have a background in psychology. So I am very, very interested in how we acquire languages, how we learn languages. And once I became a mother, I became very interested in how we acquire languages when we are multilingual, so like both of our children. And also how we can kind of apply what we know about the way children learn languages to the way adults learn languages. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Cool. Okay. So let me just continue that point then. It might sound like a really simple question, but how do children learn languages?
Okay. It is a simple question, and I think it's quite a bit more complex when you actually look inside what's happening in the brain. But basically, we are born with a superpower to learn languages. And more than learn languages, we use the term acquire languages because you actually don't need to teach a baby or a young child language. You've perhaps heard this phrase that children are like sponges. Have you heard this before? We're always told this, right?
Yeah.
And they actually are, because they do absorb everything that's happening around them. And this is specifically true between 0 and 3 years old. So there was a study done by an American psychologist, and it shows that there's like a graph. It's a very pretty graph. It starts at like when they're born until 3, and it's like top. And then from 3 until 7, it slightly goes down. And then from 7, it just starts falling. And then puberty, it drops off altogether. That's not to say that after puberty, after, around 12, 13, 15 years old, we can't learn languages, but it just does change a lot. Now, why is this? Why are children so good at learning? Well, it's the way their brains are structured. It's the way their brains are basically creating new neurons. And the rate at which they create new neurons, which are the cells in the brain, is way, way, way more than an adult brain. And when we create new neurons, it means that we learn things. We put connections together and we learn new things. So this is called plasticity, neuroplasticity. And children's brains are just basically superior than adult brains in this respect. And also children are very good at looking for patterns and order in the world around them. So they're constantly watching and listening to the world around them and trying to figure it out, trying to figure out what goes where, what goes together, what doesn't go together. And that basically makes children little superheroes when it comes to learning a language. I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry, that was a very long.
No. It does. I guess it's a funny thing because, everyone has acquired a language, and everyone has been a child, and we've all done it. We didn't know that we had these superpowers at the time, but clearly we get to a certain stage and we can speak a language or languages. So it's kind of interesting to hear you talking about how it actually works in practice. So the graph you mentioned that kind of peters off around puberty or so, that was specifically for learning languages, or it's learning anything?
No, it's specifically for learning languages. So in different practices, they talk about it in different ways, but usually it's talked about as the sensitive period for language acquisition. If they don't get access to the language, if they don't hear the language in this window, so we can say from 0 to 7, it can become more difficult to learn the language after.
Okay.
And specifically, children start becoming experts in their own language, in the sounds of their own language, by the time they're 12 months old. So they'll actually put little babies, they looked at their brains, and a baby who is used to hearing sounds in Mandarin, sounds and tones, their brain will respond in a different way, whereas a English-speaking baby won't even register because those tones don't even exist in the English language. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So that even if they're unable to recreate those sounds themselves, they're registering that these are familiar sounds that they perhaps don't understand the meaning of, but that they understand exist in their kind of worldview. If you can say that about a baby.
Yeah, they start specializing, and then from that point they continue specializing. Whereas before 12 months, they are like citizens of the world. Any baby is the same, and then they start slowly specializing more and more and more. And of course, that becomes very apparent once they start actually speaking.
Okay. How do things change, if at all, when you add multiple languages in there? When a baby is brought up either in a kind of completely multilingual environment, or when you start introducing another language at home or at school or in another situation? How does that affect things?
Well, it really depends on the time that you introduce the language. So specifically speaking about our children, so our children are multilingual and they were exposed to the different languages from birth. So in my case, my children were exposed to both English and, in my case, Catalan at home from the day they were actually born. And this is called bilingual language acquisition. And their brains will develop very much the same as a monolingual child, except they will have 2 languages, or 3 languages, or 4 languages. Whereas if a language is introduced a little bit later, then things change depending on when they start. So if we think about a baby, 4 months old, if you start using English at home, and a little bit later we'll speak about how you can use English at home. But if you start using English at home at 4 months old, they are not going to say no. They're not going to have a problem. For them, it'll be completely natural and normal if you started, reading a book to them in English, or actually speaking to them in English during a routine of the day, say during bath time. They wouldn't notice. At 12 months, that's around that same time that they're starting to become more specialized in their native language, they might start looking at you a bit strange if you started using English at home. But they're still quite open. And then around 18 months, you have to start being a little bit more careful because they might not like hearing a language that they're not used to. And this kind of continues on as they turn 2 and then 3 and 4. The way you introduce the language really does depend on the child. And it's specifically important to, and like we're going to speak about today with habits, is to build like a boundary around English time. That it's not like you're, say, having dinner together and then all of a sudden you decide to just say a phrase in English. Probably the child would be like, hey, what's happening here? I don't like this. Instead, you would have to slowly start using it in a way that felt comfortable to them, because there is this risk, and that I have heard people speak about, is that the child hears the parent use English, actually speaking it or using it in a book or on TV or with a podcast, and they don't like it. They say, no, 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 no. And then the parent doesn't know what to do. They think, oh, well, maybe they don't like it. I'll just stop. Anyways, so yeah.
Okay. So can I ask you for some advice here then? And this is actually me taking the opportunity to pick your brain to help me. So I have got as I said, 2 boys. One is 4, and one is going to be 1 in February. So one talks very happily in English and in Italian. I speak English with him. His mother speaks Italian with him. The other one, who's 10 months old, doesn't speak anything because he's 10 months old. And we will be moving in March to Sweden, and my kids will be going to Swedish school. And we're not so worried at all about the younger one, because he'll be very young, and it seems that he'll be at that kind of 12-month-old stage, just a bit older than one, where he's kind of flexible and things are just pretty easy. He's quite an easygoing character anyway. And the one who's 4, clearly he'll be going into a very different environment, and he'll be going to an environment where people speak Swedish. Neither myself nor my wife currently speak Swedish, although we are learning. We are trying our best. What advice would you have for someone like me, or a family like ours, who want to introduce another language at home in a kind of casual way, and have some of the same concerns that you mentioned, in terms of we don't want to start something and have a negative reaction to it. We want to introduce it in a friendly but helpful way to our child. What would you suggest that I do?
Yeah, absolutely. Every family is so different, and every family, if you're a parent listening to this, I'm sure the conditions that you're in are always a little bit different. But always there are certain truths. And one of them is that the societal language, so the language that's spoken in the school, in the street of where you're living, you will not need to reinforce that language. That language they will speak for sure. And it will probably become the strongest as they get older. So in your case, Alastair, at home, you and your wife don't need to do anything. You just need to keep the constancy at home of you speaking in English, your wife speaking in Italian, you speaking in whatever language between you, and your son will learn the language at daycare or at school for sure. And the little one will be totally fine, because he's got that really plastic brain with all those neural connections. He'll be totally fine. But then for someone who is wanting to introduce English into... So does that answer your question about you, like what you need to do?
It does. I'm glad the answer is do nothing.
Do nothing. You need to do absolutely nothing. I think it's possible that at the beginning, it'll be hard, I think, probably. You know, it would be hard for anyone to go into an environment where they're speaking another language. So, of course, expect that. But I mean, any change is difficult. I'm sure when your second child was born, it was probably hard and you noticed some behaviors that were like,
Mm,
hey, what's happening here?
yeah.
So this will be just a change, but he has the brain power that's totally able to deal with it. And I don't think you need to do anything extra at home. Even if perhaps someone did recommend that you needed to reinforce things at home, I would say don't, just give it time. Uh,
Okay.
and and he will learn Swedish. But sorry, I cut
That's
you off. You were going to say something.
no, that's good to know. I was wondering if there was anything that you would recommend to introduce as a kind of like soft
Hmm.
landing, which we were try and find, some cartoons on Netflix in Swedish and saying he could watch his favorite
Are
things.
there are there cartoons
Not
in
available where
Swedish?
we are, unfortunately.
Okay.
As in,
Okay.
we can't switch the language to Swedish unless
Yeah.
I'm sure we jailbreak Netflix in some way, which I'm not sure how I would do. Uh, anyway, I was wondering if there was any kind of soft landing advice that you might have, but it's good to hear that the advice is you don't need to do a huge amount if you're going to be moving there. But
Yeah.
you were just moving on to talk
Right.
about what I think is probably very interesting for lots of people
Right.
listening to this, and it's something that I hear a lot from people, actually, people
Hmm.
who are who are non-native English speakers and who perhaps have not had the best experience learning English at school and feel a little bit self-confident, sorry, a little bit conscious about their own level of English, but they don't want their kids to have the same experience as them, in terms of they want their kids to grow up enjoying English and they
Hmm.
want to introduce it from an early age, but they're not really sure exactly how to do that in the most effective way for them and for the kids. So I know this is an area that you know a lot about. So could you just talk through how you would approach that? Let's say I was an Italian or Spanish or Polish or German, whatever, family, and the language at home was the language of that country. Let's say Italian, and
Hmm.
you had a small child, and you were trying to understand how to introduce English in a way that got that child interested in English, got that child sort of understanding English from an early age, so that the child was able to make better progress than the parents had done when they were learning. So yeah, how would
Okay.
you approach that situation?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a really, I'm really happy to see so many people interested. And I'm glad that you've also had that experience with your audience, because I've definitely had it with mine. Is that now we have a whole generation of parents. A lot of us, let's say, as a very big generalization, but a lot of us are millennials. Okay. So we'll talk about like that kind of generation where the level of English is much better than that of their parents. So, whereas their parents had really no option other than letting someone else introduce their child to English and teach them English, now the generation has different options, not only because of their own language, but also because of technology. So, first off, I'd like to say that in my humble opinion, the home with you is the absolute best place to first introduce English to an infant or a young child. And that is because, number one, if you're listening to this podcast, you have a level of English. Let's say you're intermediate or above. You have a level of English that you worked really hard to get, and you now can share that with your child. And by doing that, you are showing them that English is something normal, it's something that is valuable, and it's something that is very, let's say, friendly. It's something that you can transmit a good feeling about. So, in the early years, all that you really, not all, but something that is the foundation of everything is that when your child thinks about English, when they hear English, they have like a warm, nice, good vibe feeling. And if you use it, you use English at home in a natural, fun way, they will have that. So kind of lowering the expectation that perhaps some people have of saying, okay, no, I would like, or ideally I could teach my child fluent English and they would be fully balanced bilingual. That means exact same level of their native language and English by the time they're 6 years old. I would say, no, you're going to give your child a really good head start and a good feeling with English that will then develop into something else. Now, how? How do you approach this? How do you even begin to use English at home? Maybe you've been thinking about it for a long time, but it's just never the moment because let's say you have a 6-month-old or a 9-month-old or a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old and your life is complete chaos. I understand. My life is chaos. Alastair, is your life under control?
For a few minutes
Mostly.
a day.
So this is a time in our lives where we don't have a lot of free time to invest in things that are going to pay off in the future, which is very much what we're doing when we're trying to think about, using English at home with our children. However, it's about doing simple things in your day-to-day life that are in English and that can be fun. And this key word of it being fun and feeling natural is very important. And that's why we start with little tiny steps. So 3 habits, 3 things that you can start doing. You don't have to do all 3. You can pick one, and you can do it for as much or as little time as you want. So the first thing, this is going to require you to actively use English, which means speaking in English, but it is taking caregiver routines. So what are caregiver routines? So Magda Gerber was an expert on respectful interactions with infants. And what she always said was to be extremely present when you're doing everyday caregiver routines with your child. For example, changing their diaper, okay? Or giving them a bath, or peeling a banana, things that all of us do several times a day, usually. That are parents, of course. If you're a parent, you definitely peel more than one banana. I've never met a child that doesn't like bananas. It's this weird thing. So instead of being on autopilot and having your brain somewhere else during for example, changing their diaper, you be very present, very mindful, looking at everything that's happening and really trying to communicate with them. Communicate with them if they're just tiny babies, if they're 10 months old, saying what's happening. Okay, I'm going to take off your pants now. I'm taking off your socks. And oh, I'm sorry, my hands are cold. Looking them in the eye, explaining what you're doing, explaining what perhaps you think they're feeling, and using what's around you in that moment as the source of the speech that you're producing. So
Okay.
I don't know if this seemed like something crazy, but it's something a lot of us do in our own language. Would you do this like when you're with your children?
Yes,
or?
yes. Yeah, broadly, yeah.
Okay. So it's kind of taking that thing that we probably do with our children in our own language and then doing it in English. So if they're a young child, this will be easier because they're not going to say, hey, you stop speaking to me in English. That's very strange of you to do that. That's not your language. They will accept anything that you give them, basically. But around 12 to maybe, say, 16 months and maybe even up to 2 years, there will be a point where they have a preference of what language you speak to them. So let's give the example of using English at mealtime. You could say to them, would you like a snack? Would you like an apple? Do you want me to cut the apple? Oh, is that good? Are you enjoying that? But maybe they're going to say, no, thank you. I don't want you to speak to me in English. Come on, speak in Spanish. This is weird. And that's okay.
Do you have to sort of declare that you're speaking in English now, or a
It would
child
depend.
will? Yeah.
So it would totally depend on the child, and it would depend on the age. I would say it's really difficult to say, but around, let's just say 18 months as a rule. everyone knows their own child. There are some children who are just extremely perceptive and they want to know what's happening. And in that case, it would be, hey, we're going to speak in English now. And I'm going to speak to you in English and let's see if you like it. And in other cases, maybe you could just kind of try to be a bit sneakier with a younger child, and instead of offering them an apple in your language, you offer them an apple in English. And maybe they don't even think anything of it. Maybe they do. And it all depends on the child.
Okay. Is there a risk that the child gets confused?
Gets confused of the word? Like they get confused?
Yeah, that they get confused between English and whatever language is being spoken at the other language that's being spoken at home. If there's one parent that is speaking two different languages to them, let's say that parent might be speaking Italian or Polish or German 95% of the time, but speaks English 5% of the time. Is there the risk that the child might get slightly confused between because there's one parent that's not being completely consistent?
I would say that there could the risk of getting confused, and I interpret being confused by mixing languages. Is that what you mean? Like they actually verbally are mixing languages?
Yeah. So it's nothing tragic, but more that they just aren't sure whether a word is whether it's mela in whether that's English or whether that's Italian or how to deal with this. I ask because I see with my 4-year-old that quite often if he's searching for a word in one of the languages and he kind of can't find it, he'll use that other language because he knows that my wife speaks English and I speak Italian. So he can kind of do both, even though we're very strict with we only speak we speak our own language to him. So I'm just keen to understand how you'd
what I would say about that. Absolutely. And yes, children will mix languages. I've met very few children who don't mix languages, but this is because I have met children whose parents use English at home with them a certain amount of time. Let's say 20% they use English at home and the rest of the 80% they use their native language. These children will mix languages, but around between 4 and 6, they work it out.
Okay.
It just naturally gets worked out. And in fact, with what you mentioned about your son is that he will, if he's searching for a word and he can't find it, he grabs onto the word. He knows that this is an apple and this is a poma or a manzana. He will just grab the word that he knows that you understand. Like children, the oral agility is incredible. They'll just do what they have to, which is brilliant, right? But eventually, as the two languages become much more established, they will just naturally start using the word.
Okay.
And so what we're talking about here is it's just the introduction to English, right? It's just that first contact that they have. And then they will eventually have, hopefully, a lot more exposure to the language. And whatever that looks like at school, through media of some sort, maybe playgroups, maybe going abroad. I don't know. They're going to have a lot more contact with the language. But then speaking to this idea of, okay, what most people have heard of in terms of bilingual families is one parent or one person, one language. And this has been this is like the gospel. This is like what everyone thinks is like the rule, the way you have to do things. But in fact, it's not the rule. It's just the rule that's the easiest for most bilingual families because usually there is one person that speaks one language and another person that speaks another language. So then the child knows, okay, this person does this and this person does this. But you can take a similar idea of really putting boundaries around the language and apply it to a place or a time. So this is another method. Instead of OPAL, one person, one language, you can use the time and place method. You can use a specific time of day or time of the week. For example, maybe on Sundays you use English, or maybe at bath time you use English. And the important thing here is that if you are choosing to put this boundary here, this bath time is English time, that you are consistent. That
every bath time, English time.
Yes. If you want to keep things as clear as possible, because things could get, like we spoke about, could get a little bit mixed. And this is for several reasons. And one of them is simply that children just love routine. Like most children thrive on routine. That I know what's going to happen. I know that we're going to go in the bath when we finish this activity. And then when we get there, there's going to be this toy, there's going to be this towel, and you are going to speak in English. Whereas if I'm inconsistent about what I do, they can feel a little bit of insecurity. So my advice would be to be as consistent as possible. So in terms of this first habit of using English during caregiver routines, be very mindful about it. Be very purposeful about what you do and say, okay, when I change his diaper, I speak in English. As soon as I get into that room and I see the change table, I know that I'm going to use English with the baby. Or as soon as we go to the bath, we're going to use English. Or on Sundays, when we wake up in the morning, we're going to use English. And be consistent about it. Does that kind of answer your question in a lot of words?
Consistency is key. That's how I'd summarize it. Yeah.
Exactly.
And time box things, make sure that the kids knows exactly what's going on. Okay. Great. And so I can completely understand and appreciate how that is excellent advice when you're introducing English to a young child who's kind of still finding their feet with the language. Mm-hmm. How would you, kind of moving to the next step, how can you kind of go one level further in terms of going from from changing diapers and doing baths to getting kids really interested in and using English in a deeper way? So let's say they're, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, 7, and especially keeping in mind that, in my experience at least, this is the kind of time where some people can feel conscious of their own English. Non-native speakers kind of thinking, my son or daughter might sort of laugh if I mispronounce a word, or if I say something incorrectly. I don't want to feel like I'm embarrassing myself or I'm embarrassing them. So what sort of advice would you have for someone who has perhaps, actually, let's do two different questions. The first question being someone who's gone through that first stage of introducing English already, and the second question being someone who never went through that stage and now has a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old thinking, how can I start introducing English into their life? I hope it's not too late. So yeah, right. 2 questions there.
Okay. And you mean specifically like about not feeling self-conscious?
So I mean in general, but just keeping in mind that some people might feel a little bit self-conscious about speaking English, even though they want to kind of give the gift of English to their child in the home environment, they might feel a bit conscious about doing that themselves. So I wonder if there's any techniques that you have for solving that problem.
Yeah.
Overcoming that hurdle, let's say.
Overcoming that hurdle. Well, I have a question for you. I'm going to come back at you. How did you feel when you first started speaking a second language? I don't know. What was your first second language? You know what I mean? When you started French, was that the first language that you learned?
I guess that was going back right to school. Confused, probably.
Confused. Yeah. Well, yeah, I definitely had that experience. When I started speaking Spanish, for example, when I moved to Barcelona and started learning when I got here, and I felt embarrassed, self-conscious, fearful, all of the negative emotions you kind of feel when you don't really understand something, right? And you don't dominate a language. So I think it's totally natural to feel a little bit self-conscious when you're using a language that's not your native language. But that is true almost in any context, not just using English at home. And the only way that I have discovered in all of the time that I have been teaching English, and I've had my own English school for over 10 years now, there's no way to get more comfortable than to actually use the language. It's just like there's no way through it. So if someone's feeling a little bit self-conscious about using English at home with a baby, it's kind of great because the baby's not going to laugh at you. They're not going to be like, hey, I have no idea what you're saying. So it's actually the ideal place. Now, when we think about a bit older children, let's say 4, Okay. My son just turned 5, but I remember what it's like for him to be 4. You have a 4-year-old. They are very aware of everything going on. It's not like you're going to be able to speak to them another language and they're not going to catch it. They're going to question you, right? And they can sometimes be critical. They can laugh at you. They can, and in this way, I would say that you have to just start trying to use it. You have to be very open and honest with them about what you're trying to do. We're going to use English at meal times, but then there's also the option of using English passively. So listening to English or using books in English. So if you'd like, we can just kind of quickly go back to the second and third habit, and then we'll get into more passive ways to use English, because that's perhaps a easier place to kind of start for a lot of people. It feels a lot less scary to start listening to a podcast in English with your child than speaking to them during meal times. It just naturally, passively, it's easier to consume a language. So the second habit that I recommend people doing is to do playtime in English. Now, this is going to depend on how old the child is, but imagine that we're talking about, in your case, a 10-month-old. They are sitting on the floor or maybe crawling around, and they like to build towers with blocks, for example. And this is an example of child-led play where they are playing. You are not going in and trying to direct what they're doing, but you just go down to their level and you just say what they're doing. Oh, look at you. You're putting the yellow block on top of the green block, and oh, what a great tower. And you can just observe what they're doing. So you're just getting them to hear what's happening. You're getting them to hear English based on you kind of describing, almost narrating, like a sportscaster. This is called sportscasting often, telling what's happening with their play. Then if you want, you can kind of direct the play. You can say, why don't we now play with the train? Let's put the train on the tracks and look at the train. And then as the child gets a little bit older and they start actually saying things, usually the first words are going to be in their native language, you can repeat what they say and expand on it in English. So they say, red train. And you can say, yes, look at the red train going around the track. Wow, it's going fast. So you're taking what they're saying and you're expanding on it in English. So basically, You're just looking for content to just use English.
It's also, if I could just interrupt very quickly, it's
absolutely
selfishly, it's probably it's a good opportunity for someone who's wanting to practice some English to practice it in a very non-judgmental environment, because what's a 10-month-old going to say? Excuse me, you mispronounced red.
Exactly.
So it's I guess it's good for the child, it's good for the person who might not necessarily feel like they have all these opportunities to speak.
Yes, exactly. It's absolutely true. I mean, we laugh, but it's completely true. When I started learning Spanish, I would speak to myself in my car, It was like very low stakes. And I would just practice certain pronunciation. One word that's was very difficult for me to say was dog, perro. It was just like that R was very difficult for me to get. Like a lot of English speakers have very difficult time with that rolling of the R. And I would just practice over and over. And it felt a lot less judgmental than if I had to use it in a conversation. So speaking to a child it's a great place to practice your English. And I'll take the moment here to mention that a lot of parents, this is one of the things that I've heard most often, is that they don't want their child to pick up their pronunciation. So this is a huge concern. And what I would say here is that, one, that's not the point. You're not actually teaching them pronunciation. You're just giving them contact with English. And that, two, if you think about the difference between you using English at home and you not using English at home. Okay, if you don't use English at home and you don't do anything else, you don't perhaps, get a private nanny or something like that. What's better? Of course, using English at home with your pronunciation, whatever it is. Okay. And instead of saying pronunciation, actually, I would say accent. Because of course, if you're like mangling, if you're really mispronouncing a word that it can't be understood, then maybe that's not good. However, if you're pronouncing something but with a Spanish accent, that's fine. That's okay. Because they're going to hear the words that you're using in the future. It's not like they're going to stay with your pronunciation. Their language skills are going to evolve as they get more input of English. So I would say, don't worry. Do not worry about them picking up your accent. That's not a concern at this time. Absolutely.
And similar sort of thing applies to grammatical mistakes that people might be conscious of, or is that a slightly different category?
I would say it's a very similar category. Of course, ideally, what is the ideal scenario here? Of course, the ideal scenario would be that they were, and when I say ideal, I mean the way that they would speak. How do I word this? The ideal scenario is that they would be learning from you as a native speaker. But the first condition is that it's you, because you are the best person, the one most equipped, the one with the closest relationship with them in order to teach them the language. And then the secondary thing is your level of English. So I think that people need to be aware of the fact that, yes, it's ideal that as you are using English, that you don't make massive grammatical errors. But if you do, it's okay. You can also be improving your English alongside using English at home with your kid. But they will work out those things later. They're going to learn, they'll hear correct English spoken. Certainly in the media, they're going to get more exposure to the language in the future.
Okay, so to conclude on that point, the advice being, don't worry so much about pronunciation or accents, because the important thing is you're getting your kids used to English and enjoying using English, not worrying about pronouncing things in a native type way. Don't worry also so much about, making mistakes with grammar or things like that, because there'll be other sources of input that your kids will have. So to summarize my summary, don't worry.
Exactly. I love how yours are always like, don't do anything.
Yeah.
Don't worry. Everything.
Okay.
And the thing is here is like, we're really getting into a lot of details, but the message that I want people to take home is that you have a level of English that you are able to share with your child. It is totally natural and normal for you to do that. Make it fun, make it enjoyable, and you're absolutely giving them a gift. That is the only thing that I would like to, neurons and neuroplasticity and all of this stuff, don't worry about it. It's that they have a gift to learn a language. You have a language to give them. Start doing it, basically.
Okay.
If you feel so inclined to do so. And the final habit is stories. Okay, so here is, in my opinion, perhaps the ideal place to start. If you've never used English at home before, this is a really accessible, easy place to start. So stories are everywhere, of course, but when I'm talking about stories, I mean either storybooks or using audio, using podcasts. So in the example of storybooks, a lot of people will read their children's stories before bed, during quiet time, and you can take the domain of stories and make it English. So anytime you read a story, it's in English. If you have a lot of books, but they're in your native language, you simply either translate them if you want, if you can do that. I mean, I don't mean like actually translate, like go and write. I mean, as you're reading, you just kind of translate the ideas. You can also just describe the pictures in English. I mean, children, all of what we're talking about right now is pre-literacy, so children aren't reading at this time. Or, of course, buying English books. If you could access English books, it's amazing. And the great thing is that most children love reading the same book over and over again, so you don't need a huge library. And speaking of libraries, a lot of libraries, at least here where I am, even though they're Spanish, Catalan libraries, there are a lot of books in English. And this is great because it's very flexible, in the sense when we were speaking before about the time and place method, like putting boundaries around language learning, well, around language acquisition. If you're reading a story, the child is like, okay, story, okay, English. This is English time because stories are English time. So you don't really need to do much else. They will be very comfortable with this. And it's also a great place to start because if you go to the library and get an English book and you start reading it to your 2-year-old or 4-year-old, these ages where children are more sensitive to the language that you're learning, you say, no, 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 the book is in English. So we're going to read it in English. So it's kind of like an excuse, instead of it being like, I am speaking to you in English, it's like, I am reading the book that's in English. And you make it's a book they like, whatever, with the pictures they like. And they will focus more on the content of the story instead of the medium of English being spoken to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And you also have the thing we talked about earlier. If someone was concerned about making grammatical mistakes or something like that, then that is no longer an issue if they are reading a book in English.
Exactly. And if for someone who is just simply not comfortable using English, like they don't want the child to hear them speak English yet, then there are a lot of really great podcasts. And it seems crazy to think of your child like so young listening to podcasts, but truly it is incredible. I listen to podcasts with my children. If you're listening to this right now, you are used to perhaps listening to podcasts. And children, compared to watching, for example, we know, not to get into the debate of having young, children's cognitive development and screens. There's a lot of research that indicates that screens can be not good for cognitive development in young ages, especially under 3, but even older. When they're listening to something, and as they get used to listening, they're exercising their imagination. So young children, like whereas adults, we tend to be doing things like cleaning or commuting while we're listening to podcasts. Young children just like to do fine motor skill things. So maybe they're going to be coloring something or putting together Legos. And as they're doing that task, they're just listening. Maybe they're not listening to everything, but they are listening, absolutely. And eventually they will ask you questions. What does this word mean? Maybe they'll use their native language, but they'll be engaged in what's happening. And most children will like to listen to the same episode over and over and over again. So it makes it easy. And there's 2 specific podcasts that I recommend. One is Super Simple Podcasts. I don't know if you've heard of that. That's a really good one. And another one is from Lingo Kids. Lingo Kids is an app, but they have a great podcast. So I guess the takeaway of all of this that we've spoken about is if you want to get started, these are 3 great habits, but something you could do today would be reading a story to your child in English if you feel confident to do that. And if not, put on a podcast for them and just see what happens. And if possible, you listen with them, maybe not like sitting down and listening with them, but they're playing in the living room, you're doing something else and you have the podcast on and you are. So you can hear people talk about joint watching. So instead of just putting your child in front of a TV and letting them watch, you kind of are there aware of what's happening and you make it a more social experience. Like, hey, what just happened, or commenting. You can do something similar with joint listening. And as you're listening, you can comment on things. Maybe at the beginning, you're commenting on it in your native language. Oh, that's funny, or that's cool, or whatever. But then eventually you could start commenting in English and kind of continuing the conversation and opening up that space for the 2 of you to start having a relationship through the English language.
Okay. And those 2 that you recommend, do kids have to have a pre-existing knowledge of English to access those? Or is that something that they could start today, even without a huge amount of knowledge of English?
I mean, the great thing about kids, and I think it's probably something that you're going to see with your son when he starts school, in Swedish, is that they're just very flexible. It's not like adults where if now you put a podcast on for me in Swedish, I would be like, excuse me, I don't understand anything. Kids are more flexible. So even though both of the first podcast, Super Simple Podcast, is made, actually, I take that back. both of these podcasts do have an international audience in mind. So a child who has heard English before is going to understand more, and a child who hasn't heard anything before will understand less. But it's slowly that they start hearing it. The podcasts are designed with a lot of music that is meant to engage the child, and that eventually they will start understanding more and more.
Okay, so the summary is, again, just starts. What's the worst that could happen? Your kid will probably really enjoy it.
Exactly. I love your summaries. They're wonderful. You wrap everything up so neatly.
So talking of wrapping up, I know I've been picking your brain for quite a long time now, and it's been super helpful for me to understand what I should be doing. I'm sure people listening or watching this will have got a huge amount of value from it. Are there any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our viewers?
I would say something that we kind of touched on earlier was, can adults learn anything from the way children learn? And in fact, in my opinion, absolutely yes. And that is that when we're wanting to improve English skills, for example, you just have to get your ears on what you can get your ears on. You have to listen to things that interest you. So I don't remember the name of the person, but they say that being entertained is the gateway to learning. So first you have to like something. So English learning for curious minds. You listen to it because the topics are interesting. You want to hear about different people, about different facts, about different things that are happening in the world. And because you want to listen to it, and because you enjoy listening to it, and because you're entertained, you are naturally learning English. And I would say that in general, people who are adults who are learning language should focus less on the exact, studying the grammar and mastering the conditional tenses, and more just on doing things in English that they enjoy doing, and that the learning will follow, and it will follow naturally, much the same as children's learning naturally follows if we allow them to be exposed to English.
Okay, yep, makes perfect sense. And unsurprisingly, I wholeheartedly agree with you and endorse that message. So, Bree, where can people go to find out more about you and follow along with your story and hear your words of wisdom?
Absolutely. So the best place to find the podcast is anywhere you listen to podcasts. It is called Into the Story, and we tell true stories of people from all over the world, and you learn interesting things about life. Our storytellers always give wisdom based on their life experience. So, Alastair, you've been on twice, and the first time you told a story about playing your bagpipes on the streets of Lille, France, and then a more recent time. So yeah, we can leave your listeners links to those episodes because they're very interesting, and you share lots of wisdom.
Well, it's very kind of you to say. Thank you so much, Bree. And also thank you so much for spending so much time talking with me today. And people should definitely go and check out Into the Story, which is available on all respectable podcast apps. So wonderful. Thank you very much. And have a wonderful day, Bree.